What vicious new dangers lurk in the subterranean sea? Can our explorers hope to cross it? Jules Verne, today on the Classic Tales podcast. Welcome to the Classic Tales podcast. Thank you for listening. The vintage episode for the week is Oh Whistle and I'll Come to You, My Lad, a ghost story by M.R. James. Be sure to check it out on Tuesday. If you have found value in the show, please consider becoming a monthly supporter. Help us to help other folks like you. Please go to classictalesaudiobooks.com and become a monthly supporter today. It's looking like The Treasure of the Sierra Madre by B. Traven is going to be available October 3rd. Pre-order pricing will continue until then. If you're a fan of the film, you've got to pick up the audiobook. A link can be found in the show notes, or you can go to classictalesaudiobooks.com and click the appropriate button. And now, A Journey to the Center of the Earth, Part 7 of 9 by Jules Verne. Chapter 32, Wonders of the Deep. On the 13th of August, we awoke early. We were now to begin to adopt a mode of traveling both more expeditious and less fatiguing than hitherto. A mast was made of 2 poles spliced together. A yard was made of a third. A blanket borrowed from our coverings made a tolerable sail. There was no want of cordage for the rigging, and everything was well and firmly made. The provisions, the baggage, the instruments, the guns, and a good quantity of fresh water from the rocks around all found their proper places on board, and at 6, the professor gave the signal to embark. Hans had fitted up a rudder to steer his vessel. He took the tiller and unmoored. The sail was set, and we were soon afloat. At the moment of leaving the harbor, my uncle, who was tenaciously fond of naming his new discoveries, wanted to give it a name, and proposed mine amongst others. "But I have a better to propose," I said. "Gräuben. Let it be called Port Gräuben. It will look very well upon the map." "Port Gräuben let it be, then." And so the cherished remembrance of my Virland days became associated with our adventurous expedition. The wind was from the northwest. We went with it at a high rate of speed. The dense atmosphere acted with great force and impelled us swiftly on. In an hour, my uncle had been able to estimate our progress. "At this rate," he said, "we shall make 30 leagues in 24 hours, and we shall soon come in sight of the opposite shore." I made no answer, but went and sat forward. The northern shore was already beginning to dip under the horizon. The eastern and western strands spread wide, as if to bid us farewell. Before our eyes lay far and wide a vast sea. Shadows of great clouds swept heavily over its silver-gray surface. The glistening bluish rays of electric light, here and there reflected by the dancing drops of spray, shot out little sheaves of light from the track we left in our rear. Soon we entirely lost sight of land. No object was left for the eye to judge by, and but for the frothy track of the raft, I might have thought we were standing still. About 12, immense shoals of seaweed came in sight. I was aware of the great powers of vegetation that characterize these plants, which grow at a depth of 12,000 feet, reproduce themselves under a pressure of 400 atmospheres, and sometimes form barriers strong enough to impede the course of a ship. But never, I think, were such seaweeds as those which we saw floating in immense waving lines upon the Sea of Liedenbrock. Our raft skirted the whole length of the Fuci, 3,000 or 4,000 feet long, undulating like vast serpents beyond the reach of sight. I found some amusement in tracing these endless waves, always thinking I should come to the end of them, and for hours my patience was vying with my surprise. What natural force could have produced such plants? And what must have been the appearance of the earth in the first ages of its formation, when, under the action of heat and moisture, the vegetable kingdom alone was developing on its surface? Evening came, and, as on the previous day, I perceived no change in the luminous condition of the air. It was a constant condition, the permanency of which might be relied upon. After supper, I laid myself down at the foot of the mast and fell asleep in the midst of fantastic reveries. Hans, keeping fast by the helm, let the raft run on, which, after all, needed no steering, the wind blowing directly aft. Since our departure from Port Gräuben, Professor Liedenbrock had entrusted the log to my care. I was to register every observation, make entries of interesting phenomena, the direction of the wind, the rate of sailing, the way we made, in a word, every particular of our singular voyage. I shall therefore reproduce here these daily notes, written, so to speak, as the course of events directed, in order to furnish an exact narrative of our passage. Friday, August 14th. Wind steady, northwest. The raft makes rapid way in a direct line. Coast 30 leagues to leeward. Nothing in sight before us. Intensity of light the same. Weather fine. That is to say, that the clouds are flying high, are light, and bathed in a white atmosphere resembling silver in a state of fusion. Temperature 89 degrees Fahrenheit. At noon, Hans prepared a hook at the end of a line. He baited it with a small piece of meat and flung it into the sea. For 2 hours, nothing was caught. Are these waters, then, bare of inhabitants? No. There's a pull at the line. Hans draws it in and brings out a struggling fish. "A sturgeon," I cried. "A small sturgeon." The professor eyes the creature attentively, and his opinion differs from mine. The head of this fish was flat, but rounded in front, and the anterior part of its body was plated with bony, angular scales. It had no teeth. Its pectoral fins were large, and of tail there was none. The animal belonged to the same order as the sturgeon, but differed from that fish in many essential particulars. After a short examination, my uncle pronounced his opinion. "This fish belongs to an extinct family, of which only fossil traces are found in the Devonian formations." "What?" I cried. "Have we taken alive an inhabitant of the seas of primitive ages?" "Yes, and you will observe that these fossil fishes have no identity with any living species. To have in one's possession a living specimen is a happy event for a naturalist." "But to what family does it belong?" "It is of the order of ganoids, of the family of the Cephalaspidae, and a species of Pterichthys. But this one displays a peculiarity confined to all fishes that inherit subterranean waters. It is blind, and not only blind, but it actually has no eyes at all." I looked. Nothing could be more certain. But supposing it might be a solitary case, we baited afresh and threw out our line. Surely this ocean is well peopled with fish, for in another couple of hours we took a large quantity Pterichtides, as well as of others belonging to the extinct family of the Dipterides, but of which my uncle could not tell the species. None had organs of sight. This unhoped-for catch recruited our stock of provisions. Thus it is evident that this sea contains none but species known to us in their fossil state, in which fishes, as well as reptiles, are the less perfectly and completely organized the farther back their date of creation. Perhaps we may yet meet with some of those saurians, which science has reconstructed out of a bit of bone or cartilage. I took up the telescope and scanned the whole horizon, and found it everywhere a desert sea. We are far away removed from the shores. I gaze upward in the air. Why should not some of the strange birds restored by the immortal Cuvier again flap their sail-broad vans in this dense and heavy atmosphere? There are sufficient fish for their support. I survey the whole space that stretches overhead. It is as desert as the shore was. Still, my imagination carried me away amongst the wonderful speculations of paleontology. Though awake, I fell into a dream. I thought I could see floating on the surface of the waters enormous colonia, pre-Adamite tortoises, resembling floating islands. Over the dimly lighted strand, there trod the huge mammals of the first ages of the world. The leptotherium, slender beast, found in the caverns of Brazil, the Mericotherium, ruminating beast, found in the drift of ice-clad Siberia. Farther on, the Pachydermatous Lophiodon, crested-toothed, a gigantic tapir, hides behind the rocks to dispute its prey with the Anoplotherium, unarmed beast, a strange creature, which seemed a compound of horse, rhinoceros, camel, and hippopotamus. The colossal mastodon, nipple-toothed, twists and untwists his trunk, and brays and pounds with his huge tusks the fragment of rock that cover the shore, whilst the megatherium, huge beast, buttressed upon his enormous hinder paws, grubs in the soil, awakening the sonorous echoes of the granite rocks with his tremendous roarings. Higher up, the Protopitheca, the first monkey that appeared on the globe, is climbing up the steep ascents. Higher yet, the pterodactyl, wing-fingered, darts in irregular zigzags to and fro in the heavy air. In the uppermost regions of the air, immense birds, more powerful than a cassowary and larger than the ostrich, spread their vast breadth of wings and strike with their heads the granite vault that bounds the sky. All this fossil world rises to life again in my vivid imagination. I return to the scriptural periods or ages of the world, conventionally called days, long before the appearance of man, when the unfinished world was as yet unfitted for his support. Then my dream backed even farther still into the ages before the creation of living beings. The mammals disappear, then the birds vanish, then the reptiles of the secondary period, and finally the fish, the crustaceans, mollusks, and articulated beings. Then the zoophytes of the transition period also return to nothing. I am the only living thing in the world. All life is concentrated in my beating heart alone. There are no more seasons, climates are no more. The heat of the globe continually increases and neutralizes that of the sun. Vegetation becomes accelerated. I glide like a shade amongst arborescent ferns, treading with unsteady feet the colored marls and the party-colored clays. I lean for support against the trunks of immense conifers. I lie in the shade of stenophila, wedge-leaved, asterophila, star-leaved, and lycopods, 100 feet high. Ages seem no more than days. I am passed, against my will, in retrograde order, through the long series of terrestrial changes. Plants disappear. Granite rocks soften. Intense heat converts solid bodies into thick fluids. The waters again cover the face of the earth. They boil. They rise in whirling eddies of steam. White and ghastly mists wrap round the shifting forms of the earth, which by imperceptible degrees dissolves into a gaseous mass, glowing fiery red and white, as large and as shining as the sun. And I myself am floating with wild caprice in the midst of this nebulous mass of 1,400,000 times the volume of the earth, into which it will one day be condensed and carried forward amongst the planetary bodies. My body is no longer firm and terrestrial. It is resolved into its constituent atoms, subtilized, volatilized, sublimed into imponderable vapor. I mingle and am lost in the endless foods of those vast globular volumes of vaporous mists, which roll upon their flaming orbits through infinite space. But is it not a dream? Whither is it carrying me? My feverish hand has vainly attempted to describe upon paper its strange and wonderful details. I have forgotten everything that surrounds me. The professor, the guide, the raft, all are gone out of my ken. An illusion has laid hold upon me.
"What is the matter?"
My uncle breaks in. My staring eyes are fixed vacantly upon him.
"Take care, Axel, or you will fall overboard."
At that moment, I felt the sinewy hand of Hans seizing me vigorously. But for him, carried away by my dream, I should have thrown myself into the sea.
"Is he mad?"
cried the professor. "What is it all about?" At last I cried, returning to myself.
"Do you feel ill?"
my uncle asked. "No, but I have had a strange hallucination. It is over now. Is all going on right?"
"Yes. It is a fair wind and a fine sea. We are sailing rapidly along, and if I am not out in my reckoning, we shall soon land."
At these words I rose and gazed round upon the horizon, still everywhere bounded by clouds alone. Chapter 33. A Battle of Monsters. Saturday, August 15th. The sea unbroken all round. No land in sight. The horizon seems extremely distant. My head is still stupefied with the vivid reality of my dream. My uncle has had no dreams, and he is out of temper. He examines the horizon all round with his glass, and folds his arm with the air of an injured man. I remark that Professor Liedenbrock has a tendency to relapse into an impatient mood, and I make a note of it in my log. All my danger and sufferings were needed to strike a spark of human feeling out of him. But now that I am well, his nature has resumed its sway. And yet what cause was there for anger? Is not the voyage prospering as favorably as possible under the circumstances? Is not the raft spinning along with marvelous speed? "You seem anxious, my uncle," I said, seeing him continually with his glass to his eye.
"Anxious? No, not at all."
"Impatient, then?"
"One might be, with less reason than now."
"Yet we are going very fast."
"What does that signify? I am not complaining that the rate is slow, but that the sea is so wide."
I then remembered that the professor, before starting, had estimated the length of this underground sea at 30 leagues. Now we had made 3 times the distance, yet still the southern coast was not in sight.
"We are not descending as we ought to be," the professor declares. "We are losing time, and the fact is, I have not come all this way to take a little sail upon a pond on a raft."
He called this sea a pond, and our long voyage taking a little sail. "But," I remarked, "since we have followed the road that Saknussemm has shown us—"
"That is just the question. Have we followed that road? Did Saknussemm meet this sheet of water? Did he cross it? Has not the stream that we followed led us altogether astray?"
"At any rate, we cannot feel sorry to have come so far. This prospect is magnificent, and—"
"But I don't care for prospects. I came out with an object, and I mean to attain it. Therefore don't talk to me about views and prospects."
I take this as my answer, and I leave the professor to bite his lips with impatience. At 6 in the evening, Hans asks for his wages, and his 3 Rix-dollars are counted out to him. Sunday, August 16th. Nothing new. Weather unchanged. The wind freshens. On awaking, my first thought was to observe the intensity of the light. I was possessed with an apprehension lest the electric light should grow dim or fail altogether. But there seemed no reason to fear. The shadow of the raft was clearly outlined upon the surface of the waves. Truly, this sea is of infinite width. It must be as wide as the Mediterranean or the Atlantic, and why not? My uncle took soundings several times. He tied the heaviest of our pickaxes to a long rope, which he let down 200 fathoms. No bottom yet, and we had some difficulty in hauling up our plummet. But when the pick was shipped again, Hans pointed out on its surface deep prints, as if it had been violently compressed between 2 hard bodies. I looked at the hunter.
"Tender," said he.
I could not understand him. and turned to my uncle, who was entirely absorbed in his calculations. I had rather not disturb him while he was quiet. I returned to the Icelander. He, by a snapping motion of his jaws, conveys his ideas to me. "Teeth!" I cried, considering the iron bar with more attention. "Yes, indeed. Those are the marks of teeth imprinted upon the metal. The jaws which they arm must be possessed of amazing strength. Is there some monster beneath us, belonging to the extinct races, more voracious than the shark, more fearful in vastness than the whale? I could not take my eyes off this indented iron bar. Surely, will my last night's dream be realized?" These thoughts agitated me all day, and my imagination scarcely calmed down after several hours' sleep. Monday, August 17th. I am trying to recall the peculiar instincts of the monsters of the pre-Adamite world, who, coming next in succession after the mollusks, the crustaceans and the fishes, preceded the animals of the mammalian race upon the earth. The world then belonged to reptiles. These monsters held the mastery of the seas of the secondary period. They possessed the perfect organization, gigantic proportions, prodigious strength. The saurians of our day, the alligators and the crocodiles, are but feeble reproductions of their forefathers of primitive ages. I shudder as I recall these monsters to my remembrance. No human eye has ever beheld them living. They burdened this earth 1,000 ages before man appeared, but their fossil remains, found in the argillaceous limestone called by the English the lias, have enabled their colossal structure to be perfectly built up again and anatomically ascertained. I saw at the Hamburg Museum the skeleton of one of these creatures 30 feet in length. Am I then fated, I, a denizen of earth, to be placed face to face with these representatives of long extinct families? No, surely it cannot be. Yet the deep marks of conical teeth upon the iron pick are certainly those of the crocodile. My eyes are fearfully bent upon the sea. I dread to see one of these monsters darting forth from its submarine caverns. I suppose Professor Liedenbrock was of my opinion too, and even shared my fears, for after having examined the pick, his eyes traversed the ocean from side to side. What a very bad notion that was of his, I thought to myself, to take soundings just here. He has disturbed some monstrous beast in its remote den, and if we are not attacked on our voyage— I look at our guns and see that they are all right. My uncle notices it, and looks on approvingly. Already, widely disturbed regions of the surface of the water indicate some commotion below. The danger is approaching. We must be on the lookout. Tuesday, August 18th. Evening came, or rather, the time came when sleep weighs down the weary eyelids, for there is no night here, and the ceaseless light wearies the eyes with its persistency, just as if we were sailing under an Arctic sun. Hans was at the helm. During his watch, I slept. 2 hours afterwards, a terrible shock awoke me. The raft was heaved up on a watery mountain and pitched down again at a distance of 20 fathoms.
"What is the matter?" shouted my uncle. "Have we struck land?"
Hans pointed with his finger at a dark mass 600 yards away, rising and falling alternately with heavy plunges. I looked and cried, "It is an enormous porpoise!"
"Yes," replied my uncle, "and there is a sea lizard of vast size."
And farther on, a monstrous crocodile. Look at its vast jaws and its rows of teeth. It is diving down.
"There's a whale! A whale!" cried the professor. "I can see its great fins. See how he is throwing out air and water through his blowers."
And in fact, 2 liquid columns were rising to a considerable height above the sea. We stood amazed, thunderstruck, at the presence of such a herd of marine monsters. They were of supernatural dimensions. The smallest of them would have crunched our raft, crew and all, at one snap of its huge jaws. Hans wanted to tack to get away from this dangerous neighborhood, but he sees, on the other hand, enemies not less terrible. A tortoise, 40 feet long, and a serpent of 30, lifting its fearful head and gleaming eyes above the flood. Flight was out of the question now. The reptiles rose. They wheeled around our little craft with a rapidity greater than that of express trains. They described around us gradually narrowing circles. I took up my rifle, but what could a ball do against the scaly armor with which these enormous beasts were clad? We stood dumb with fear. They approached us close. On one side the crocodile, on the other the serpent. The remainder of the sea monsters have disappeared. I prepare to fire. Hans stops me by a gesture. The two monsters pass within 150 yards of the raft and hurl themselves the one upon the other with a fury which prevents them from seeing us. At 300 yards from us, the battle was fought. We could distinctly observe the two monsters engaged in deadly conflict. But it now seems to me as if the other animals were taking part in the fray. The porpoise, the whale, the lizard, the tortoise. Every moment I seem to see one or other of them. I point them to the Icelander. He shakes his head negatively. "Twa," says he. "What two? Does he mean that there are only two animals?"
"He is right,"
said my uncle, whose glasses never left his eye. "Surely you must be mistaken," I cried.
"No. The first of those monsters has a porpoise's snout, a lizard's head, a crocodile's teeth, and hence our mistake. It is the ichthyosaurus, the fish lizard, the most terrible of the ancient monsters of the deep."
"And the other?"
"The other is a plesiosaurus, almost lizard, a serpent, armored with the carapace and the paddles of a turtle. He is the dreadful enemy of the other."
Hans had spoken truly. Two monsters only were creating all this commotion, and before my eyes are two reptiles of the primitive world. I can distinguish the eye of the ichthyosaurus glowing like a red-hot coal and as large as a man's head. Nature has endowed it with an optical apparatus of extreme power and capable of resisting the pressure of the great volume of water in the depths it inhabits. It has been appropriately called the saurian whale, for it has both the swiftness and the rapid movements of this monster of our own day. This one is not less than 100 feet long, and I can judge of its size when it sweeps over the waters the vertical coils of its tail. Its jaw is enormous, and according to naturalists, it is armed with no less than 182 teeth. The plesiosaurus, a serpent with a cylindrical body and a short tail, has 4 flappers or paddles to act like oars. Its body is entirely covered with a thick armor of scales, and its neck, as flexible as a swan's, rises 30 feet above the waves. Those huge creatures attacked each other with the greatest animosity. They heaved around them liquid mountains, which rolled even to our raft and rocked it perilously. 20 times we were near capsizing. Hissings of prodigious force are heard. The two beasts are fast locked together. I cannot distinguish the one from the other. The probable rage of the conqueror inspires us with intense fear. 1 hour, 2 hours pass away. The struggle continues with unabated ferocity. The combatants alternately approach and recede from our raft. We remain motionless, ready to fire. Suddenly the ichthyosaurus and the plesiosaurus disappear below, leaving a whirlpool eddying in the water. Several minutes pass by while the fight goes on underwater. All at once an enormous head is darted up, the head of the plesiosaurus. The monster is wounded to death. I no longer see his scaly armor, only his long neck shoots up, drops again, coils and uncoils, droops, lashes the waters like a gigantic whip, and writhes like a worm that you tread on. The water is splashed for a long way around. The spray almost blinds us, but soon the reptile's agony draws to an end. Its movements become fainter. Its contortions cease to be so violent, and the long serpentine form lies a lifeless log on the laboring deep. As for the ichthyosaurus, has he returned to his submarine cavern, or will he reappear on the surface of the sea? Chapter 34. The Great Geyser. Wednesday, August 19th. Fortunately, the wind blows violently and has enabled us to flee from the scene of the late terrible struggle. Hans keeps at his post at the helm. My uncle, whom the absorbing incidents of the combat had drawn away from his contemplations, began again to look impatiently around him. The voyage resumes its uniform tenor, which I don't care to break with a repetition of such events as yesterday's. Thursday, August 20th. Wind nor-northeast, unsteady and fitful. Temperature high. Rate 3.5 leagues an hour. About noon, a distant noise was heard. I note the fact without being able to explain it. It is a continuous roar.
In the distance, says the professor, there is a rock or islet against which the sea is breaking.
Hans climbs up the mast, but sees no breakers. The ocean is smooth and unbroken to its farthest limit. 3 hours pass away. The roaring seemed to proceed from a very distant waterfall. I remark upon this to my uncle, who replies doubtfully,
"Yes, I am convinced that I am right."
Are we then speeding forward to some cataract which will cast us down an abyss? This method of getting on may please the professor because it is vertical, but for my part, I prefer the more ordinary modes of horizontal progression. At any rate, some leagues to the windward, there must be some noisy phenomenon, for now the roarings are heard with increasing loudness. Do they proceed from the sky or the ocean? I look up to the atmospheric vapors and try to fathom their depths. The sky is calm and motionless. The clouds have reached the utmost limit of the lofty vault, and there lie still, bathed in the bright glare of the electric light. It is not there that we must seek for the cause of this phenomenon. Then I examine the horizon, which is unbroken and clear of all mist. There is no change in its aspect. But if this noise arises from a fall, a cataract, if all this ocean flows away headlong into a lower basin yet, if that deafening roar is produced by a mass of falling water, the current must needs accelerate, and its increasing speed will give me the measure of the peril that threatens us. I consult the current. There is none. I throw an empty bottle into the sea. It lies still. About 4, Hans rises, lays hold of the mast, climbs to its top. Thence his eye sweeps a large area of sea, and it is fixed upon a point. His countenance exhibits no surprise, but his eye is immovably steady.
"He sees something," says my uncle.
I believe he does. Hans comes down, then stretches his arm to the south, saying,
"They near." "Down there?" repeated my uncle.
Then, seizing his glass, he gazes attentively for a minute, which seems to me an age.
"Yes, yes," he cried. "I see a vast inverted cone rising from the surface."
Is it another sea beast?
"Perhaps it is."
Then let us steer farther westward, for we know something of the danger of coming across monsters of that sort.
"Let us go straight on," replied my uncle.
I appealed to Hans. He maintained his course inflexibly. Yet, if at our present distance from the animal, a distance of 12 leagues at least, the column of water driven through its blowers may be distinctly seen, it must needs be of a vast size. The commonest prudence would counsel immediate flight, but we did not come so far to be prudent. Imprudently, therefore, we pursue our way. The nearer we approach, the higher mounts the jet of water. What monster can possibly fill itself with such a quantity of water and spurt it up so continuously? At 8 in the evening, we are not 2 leagues distant from it. Its body, dusky, enormous, hillocky, lies spread upon the sea like an islet. Is it illusion or fear? Its length seems to me a couple of 1,000 yards. What can be this cetacean, which neither Cuvier nor Blumenbach knew anything about, It lies motionless, as if asleep. The sea seems unable to move it in the least. It is the waves that undulate upon its sides. The column of water thrown up to a height of 500 feet falls in rain with a deafening uproar. And here we are, scudding like lunatics before the wind to get near to a monster that 100 whales a day would not satisfy. Terror seizes upon me. I refuse to go further. I will cut the halyards if necessary. I am in open mutiny against the professor, who vouchsafes no answer. Suddenly Hans rises, and pointing with his finger at the menacing object, he says,
"Home." "An island!"
cries my uncle. "That's not an island," I cried skeptically.
"It's nothing else,"
shouted the professor with a loud laugh. "But that column of water?"
"Geyser,"
said Hans.
"No doubt it is a geyser, like those in Iceland."
At first I protest against being so widely mistaken as to have taken an island for a marine monster. But the evidence is against me, and I have to confess my error. It is nothing worse than a natural phenomenon. As we approach nearer, the dimensions of the liquid column become magnificent. The islet resembles, with the most deceiving likeness, an enormous cetacean, whose head dominates the waves at a height of 20 yards. The geyser, a word meaning fury, rises majestically from its extremity. Deep and heavy explosions are heard from time to time, when the enormous jet, possessed with more furious violence, shakes its plumy crest and springs with a bound till it reaches the lowest stratum of the clouds. It stands alone. No steam vents, no hot springs surround it, and all the volcanic power of the region is concentrated here. Sparks of electric fire mingle with the dazzling sheaf of lighted fluid, every drop of which refracts the prismatic colors.
"Let us land," said the professor.
"But we must carefully avoid this waterspout, which would sink our raft in a moment." Hans, steering with his usual skill, brought us to the other extremity of the islet. I leaped upon the rock. My uncle lightly followed, while our hunter remained at his post, like a man too wise ever to be astonished. We walked upon granite mingled with silicious tufa. The soil shivers and shakes under our feet, like the sides of an overheated boiler filled with steam struggling to get loose. We come in sight of a small central basin, out of which the geyser springs. I plunge a register thermometer into the boiling water. It marks an intense heat of 325 degrees, which is far above the boiling point. Therefore, this water issues from an ardent furnace, which is not at all in harmony with Professor Liedenbrock's theories. I cannot help making a remark.
"Well," he replied, "how does that make against my doctrine?"
"Oh, nothing at all," I said, seeing that I was going in opposition to immovable obstinacy. Still, I am constrained to confess that hitherto we have been wonderfully favored, and that for some reason unknown to myself, we have accomplished our journey under singularly favorable conditions of temperature. But it seems manifest to me that some day we shall reach a region where the central heat attains its highest limits and goes beyond a point that can be registered by our thermometers.
"That is what we shall see,"
so says the professor, who, having named this volcanic islet after his nephew, gives the signal to embark again. For some minutes I am still contemplating the geyser. I notice that it throws up its column of water with variable force, sometimes sending it to a great height, then again to a lower, which I attribute to the variable pressure of the steam accumulated in its reservoir. At last we leave the island, rounding away past the low rocks on its southern shore. Hans has taken advantage of the halt to refit his rudder. But before going any farther, I make a few observations to calculate the distance we have gone over and note them in my journal. We have crossed 270 leagues of sea since leaving Port Gräuben, and we are 620 leagues from Iceland under England. Chapter 35. An electric storm. Friday, August 21st. On the morrow, the magnificent geyser had disappeared. The wind had risen, and as rapidly carried us away from Axel Island. The roarings become lost in the distance. The weather, if we may use that term, will change before long. The atmosphere is charged with vapors, pervaded with the electricity generated by the evaporation of saline waters. The clouds are sinking lower and assume an olive hue. The electric light can scarcely penetrate through the dense curtain which has dropped over the theater on which the battle of the elements is about to be waged. I feel peculiar sensations, like many creatures on Earth at the approach of violent atmospheric changes. The heavy voluted cumulus clouds lower gloomily and threateningly. They wear that implacable look which I have sometimes noticed at the outbreak of a great storm. The air is heavy. The sea is calm. In the distance, the clouds resemble great bales of cotton, piled up in picturesque disorder. By degrees they dilate, and gain in huge size what they lose in number. Such is their ponderous weight that they cannot rise from the horizon. But, obeying an impulse from higher currents, their dense consistency slowly yields. The gloom upon them deepens, and they soon present to our view a ponderous mass of almost level surface. From time to time, a fleecy tuft of mist, with yet some gleaming light left upon it, drops down upon the dense floor of gray, and loses itself in the opaque and impenetrable mass. The atmosphere is evidently charged and surcharged with electricity. My whole body is saturated. My hair bristles, just as when you stand upon an insulated stool under the action of an electrical machine. It seems to me as if my companions, the moment they touched me, would receive a severe shock like that from an electric eel. At 10 in the morning, the symptoms of storm became aggravated. The wind never lulls but to acquire increased strength. The vast bank of heavy clouds is a huge reservoir of fearful windy gusts and rushing storms. I am loath to believe these atmospheric menaces, and yet I cannot help muttering, "Here's some very bad weather coming on." The professor made no answer. His temper is awful, to judge from the working of his features, as he sees this vast length of ocean unrolling before him to an indefinite extent. He can only spare time to shrug his shoulders viciously. "There's a heavy storm coming on," I cried, pointing towards the horizon. "Those clouds seem as if they were going to crush the sea." A deep silence falls on all around. The lately roaring winds are hushed into a dead calm. Nature seems to breathe no more, and to be sinking into the stillness of death. On the mast already, I see the light play of a lambent St. Elmo's fire. The outstretched sail catches not a breath of wind, and hangs like a sheet of lead. The rudder stands motionless in a sluggish, waveless sea. But if we have now ceased to advance, why do we yet leave that sail loose, which at the first shock of the tempest may capsize us in a moment? "Let us reef the sail and cut the mast down," I cried. "That will be safest."
"No, no, never!" shouted my impetuous uncle. "Never! Let the wind catch us if it will. What I want is to get the least glimpse of rock or shore, even if our raft should be smashed into shivers."
The words were hardly out of his mouth when a sudden change took place in the southern sky. The piled-up vapors condense into water, and the air, put into violent action to supply the vacuum left by the condensation of the mists, rouses itself into a whirlwind. It rushes on from the farthest recesses of the vast cavern. The darkness deepens. Scarcely can I jot down a few hurried notes. The helm makes a bound. My uncle falls full length. I creep close to him. He has laid a firm hold upon a rope, and appears to watch with grim satisfaction this awful display of elemental strife. Hans stirs not. His long hair, blown by the pelting storm and laid flat across his immovable countenance, makes him a strange figure. for the end of each lock of loose flowing hair is tipped with little luminous radiations. This frightful mask of electric sparks suggests to me, even in this dizzy excitement, a comparison with pre-Adamite man, the contemporary of the ichthyosaurus and the megatherium. The mast yet holds firm. The sail stretches tight like a bubble ready to burst. The raft flies at a rate that I cannot reckon, but not so fast as the foaming clouds of spray which it dashes from side to side in its headlong speed. "The sail! The sail!" I cry, motioning to lower it.
"No,"
replies my uncle.
"Nay,"
repeats Hans, leisurely shaking his head. But now the rain forms a rushing cataract in front of that horizon toward which we are running with such maddening speed. But before it has reached us, the rain clouds part asunder, the sea boils, and the electric fires are brought into violent action by a mighty chemical power that descends from the higher regions. The most vivid flashes of lightning are mingled with the violent crash of continuous thunder. Ceaseless fiery arrows dart in and out amongst the flying thunderclouds. The vaporous mass soon glows with incandescent heat. Hailstones rattle fiercely down, and as they dash upon our iron tools, they too emit gleams and flashes of lurid light. The heaving waves resemble fiery volcanic hills, each belching forth its own interior flames, and every crest is plumed with dancing fire. My eyes fail under the dazzling light. My ears are stunned with the incessant crash of thunder. I must be bound to the mast, which bows like a reed before the mighty strength of the storm. Here my notes become vague and indistinct. I have only been able to find a few which I seem to have jotted down almost unconsciously, but their very brevity and their obscurity reveal the intensity of the excitement which dominated me, and describe the actual position even better than my memory could do. Sunday, the 23rd. Where are we? Driven forward with a swiftness that cannot be measured. The night was fearful, no abatement of the storm. The din and uproar are incessant. Our ears are bleeding. To exchange a word is impossible. The lightning flashes with intense brilliancy, and never seems to cease for a moment. Zigzag streams of bluish-white fire dash down upon the sea and rebound, and then take an upward flight till they strike the granite vault that overarches our heads. Suppose that solid roof should crumble down upon our heads. Other flashes with incessant play cross their vivid fires, while others again roll themselves into balls of living fire which explode like bombshells, but the music of which scarcely adds to the din of the battle strife that almost deprives us of our senses of hearing and sight. The limit of intense loudness has been passed within which the human ear can distinguish one sound from another. If all the powder magazines in the world were to explode at once, we should hear no more than we do now. From the undersurface of the clouds, there are continual emissions of lurid light. Electric matter is in continual evolution from their component molecules. The gaseous elements of the air need to be slaked with moisture, for innumerable columns of water rush upwards into the air and fall back again in white foam. Whither are we flying? My uncle lies full length across the raft. The heat increases. I refer to the thermometer. It indicates the figure is obliterated. Monday, August 24th. Will there be an end to it? Is the atmospheric condition, having once reached this density, to become final? We are prostrated and worn out with fatigue. But Hans is as usual. The raft bears on still to the southeast. We have made 200 leagues since we left Axel Island. At noon, the violence of the storm redoubles. We are obliged to secure as fast as possible every article that belongs to our cargo. Each of us is lashed to some part of the raft. The waves rise above our heads. For 3 days, we have never been able to make each other hear a word. Our mouths open, our lips move, but not a word can be heard. We cannot even make ourselves heard by approaching our mouth close to the ear. My uncle has drawn nearer to me. He has uttered a few words. They seem to be, "We are lost," but I am not sure. At last I write down the words, "Let us lower the sail." He nods his consent. Scarcely has he lifted his head again before a ball of fire has bounded over the waves and lighted on board our raft. Mast and sail flew up in an instant together, and I saw them carried up to prodigious height, resembling in appearance a pterodactyl, one of those strong birds of the infant world. We lay there, our blood running cold with unspeakable terror. The fireball, half of it white, half azure blue, and the size of a 10-inch shell, moved slowly about the raft, but revolving on its own axis with astonishing velocity, as if whipped round by the force of the whirlwind. Here it comes, there it glides. Now it is up the ragged stump of the mast, thence it lightly leaps on the provision bag, descends with a light bound, and just skims the powder magazine. Horrible. We shall be blown up. But no, the dazzling disk of mysterious light nimbly leaps aside. It approaches Hans, who fixes his blue eye upon it steadily. It threatens the head of my uncle, who falls upon his knees with his head down to avoid it. And now my turn comes. Pale and trembling under the blinding splendor and the melting heat, it drops at my feet, spinning silently round upon the deck. I try to move my foot away, but cannot. A suffocating smell of nitrogen fills the air. It enters the throat. It fills the lungs. We suffer stifling pains. Why am I unable to move my foot? Is it riveted to the planks? Alas, the fall upon our fated raft of this electric globe has magnetized every iron article on board. The instruments, the tools, our guns, are clashing and clanking violently in their collisions with each other. The nails of my boots cling tenaciously to a plate of iron let into the timbers, and I cannot draw my foot away from the spot. At last, by a violent effort, I release myself at the instant when the ball in its gyrations was about to seize upon it and carry me off my feet. Ah, what a flood of intense and dazzling light! The globe has burst, and we are deluged with tongues of fire. Then all light disappears. I could just see my uncle at full length on the raft, and Hans still at the helm and spitting fire under the action of the electricity which has saturated him. But where are we going to? Where? Tuesday, August 25th. I recover from a long swoon. The storm continues to roar and rage. The lightnings dash hither and thither, like broods of fiery serpents filling all the air. Are we still under the sea? Yes, we are borne at incalculable speed. We have been carried under England, under the Channel, under France, perhaps under the whole of Europe. A fresh noise is heard. Surely it is the sea breaking upon the rocks. But then... Chapter 36. Calm, Philosophic Discussions. Here I end what I may call my log, happily saved from the wreck, and I resume my narrative as before. What happened when the raft was dashed upon the rocks is more than I can tell. I felt myself hurled into the waves, and if I escaped from death, and if my body was not torn over the sharp edges of the rocks, it was because the powerful arm of Hans came to my rescue. The brave Icelander carried me out of the reach of the waves, over a burning sand where I found myself by the side of my uncle. Then he returned to the rocks, against which the furious waves were beating, to save what he could. I was unable to speak. I was shattered with fatigue and excitement. I wanted a whole hour to recover, even a little. But a deluge of rain was still falling, though with that violence which generally denotes the near cessation of a storm. A few overhanging rocks afforded us some shelter from the storm. Hans prepared some food, which I could not touch, and each of us, exhausted with 3 sleepless nights, fell into a broken and painful sleep. The next day, the weather was splendid. The sky and the sea had sunk into sudden repose. Every trace of the awful storm had disappeared. The exhilarating voice of the professor fell upon my ears as I awoke. He was ominously cheerful.
"Well, my boy," he cried, "have you slept well?"
Would not anyone have thought that we were still in our cheerful little house on the Königstrasse, and that I was only just coming down to breakfast, and that I was to be married to Gräuben that day? Alas, if the tempest had but sent the raft a little more east, we should have passed under Germany, under my beloved town of Hamburg, under the very street where dwelt all that I loved most in the world. Then only 40 leagues would have separated us, but they were 40 leagues perpendicular of solid granite wall, and in reality we were 1,000 leagues asunder. All these painful reflections rapidly crossed my mind before I could answer my uncle's question.
"Well now," he repeated, "won't you tell me how you have slept?"
"Oh, very well," I said. "I am only a little knocked up, but I shall soon be better."
"Oh," says my uncle, "that's nothing to signify. You are only a little bit tired."
"But you, uncle, you seem in very good spirits this morning."
"Delighted, my boy, delighted. We have got there."
"To our journey's end?"
"No, but we have got to the end of that endless sea. Now we shall go by land and really begin to go down, down, down."
"But my dear uncle, do let me ask you one question."
"Of course, Axel."
"How about returning?"
"Returning? Why, you are talking about the return before the arrival."
"No, I only want to know how that is to be managed."
"In the simplest way possible. When we have reached the center of the globe, either we shall find some new way to get back, or we shall come back like decent folks the way we came. I feel pleased at the thought that it is sure not to be shut against us."
"But then we shall have to refit the raft."
"Of course."
"Then, as to provisions, have we enough to last?"
"Yes, to be sure we have. Hans is a clever fellow, and I am sure he must have saved a large part of our cargo. But still, let us go and make sure."
We left this grotto, which lay open to every wind. At the same time I cherished a trembling hope, which was a fear as well. It seemed to me impossible that the terrible wreck of the raft should not have destroyed everything on board. On my arrival on the shore, I found Hans surrounded by an assemblage of articles, all arranged in good order. My uncle shook hands with him with a lively gratitude. This man, with almost superhuman devotion, had been at work all the while that we were asleep, and had saved the most precious of the articles at the risk of his life. Not that we had suffered no losses. For instance, our firearms, but we might do without them. Our stock of powder had remained uninjured, after having risked blowing up during the storm.
"Well," cried the professor, "as we have no guns, we cannot hunt, that's all."
"Yes, but how about the instruments?"
"Here is the aneroid, the most useful of all, and for which I would have given all the others. By means of it, I can calculate the depth and know when we have reached the center. Without it, we might very likely go beyond and come out at the antipodes."
Such high spirits as these were rather too strong. "But where is the compass?" I asked.
"Here it is, upon this rock, in perfect condition, as well as the thermometer and the chronometer. The hunter is a splendid fellow."
There was no denying it. We had all our instruments. As for tools and appliances, there they all lay on the ground, ladders, ropes, picks, spades, etc. Still, there was the question of provisions to be settled, and I asked, "How are we off for provisions?" The boxes containing these were in a line upon the shore, in a perfect state of preservation. For the most part, the sea had spared them, and what with biscuits, salt meat, spirits, and salt fish, we might reckon on 4 months' supply.
4 months, cried the professor. We have time to go and to return, and with what is left, I will give a grand dinner to my friends at the Johanneum.
I ought by this time to have been quite accustomed to my uncle's ways, yet there was always something fresh about him to astonish me.
Now, said he, we will replenish our supply of water with the rain which the storm has left in all these granite basins. Therefore, we shall have no reason to fear anything from thirst. As for the raft, I will recommend Hans to do his best to repair it, although I don't expect it will be of any further use to us."
"How so?" I cried.
"An idea of my own, my lad. I don't think we shall come out by the way that we went in."
I stared at the professor with a good deal of mistrust. I asked, was he not touched in the brain? And yet there was method in his madness.
"And now let us go to breakfast," said he.
I followed him to a headland, after he had given his instructions to the hunter. There, preserved meat, biscuit, and tea made us an excellent meal, one of the best I ever remember. Hunger, the fresh air, the calm, quiet weather, after the commotions we had gone through, all contributed to give me a good appetite. Whilst breakfasting, I took the opportunity to put to my uncle the question where we were now. "That seems to me," I said, "rather difficult to make out."
"Yes, it is difficult," he said, "to calculate exactly, perhaps even impossible, since during these 3 stormy days I have been unable to keep any account of the rate or direction of the raft, but still we may get an approximation."
"The last observation," I remarked, "was made on the island, when the geyser was—"
"You mean Axel Island. Don't decline the honor of having given your name to the first island ever discovered in the central parts of the globe."
"Well," said I, "let it be Axel Island. Then we had cleared 270 leagues of sea, and we were 600 leagues from Iceland."
"Very well," answered my uncle. "Let us start from that point and count 4 days' storm, during which our rate cannot have been less than 80 leagues in the 24 hours.
"That is right. And this would make 300 leagues more."
"Yes, and the Leidenbrock Sea would be 600 leagues from shore to shore. Surely, Axel, it may vie in size with the Mediterranean itself."
"Especially," I replied, "if it happens that we have only crossed it in its narrowest part. And it is a curious circumstance," I added, "that if my computations are right, and we are 900 leagues from Reykjavik, we have now the Mediterranean above our head."
"That is a good long way, my friend. But whether we are under Turkey or the Atlantic depends very much upon the question in which direction we have been moving. Perhaps we have deviated."
"No, I think not. Our course has been the same all along, and I believe this shore is southeast of Port Gräuben."
"Well," replied my uncle, "we may easily ascertain this by consulting the compass. Let us go and see what it says."
The professor moved towards the rock upon which Hans had laid down the instruments. He was gay and full of spirits. He rubbed his hands. He studied his attitudes. I followed him, curious to know if I was right in my estimate. As soon as we had arrived at the rock, my uncle took the compass, laid it horizontally, and questioned the needle, which, after a few oscillations, presently assumed a fixed position. My uncle looked and looked and looked again. He rubbed his eyes, and then turned to me thunderstruck with some unexpected discovery. "What is the matter?" I asked. He motioned to me to look. An exclamation of astonishment burst from me. The north pole of the needle was turned to what we supposed to be the south. It pointed to the shore instead of to the open sea. I shook the box, examined it again. It was in perfect condition. In whatever position I placed the box, the needle pertinaciously returned to this unexpected quarter. Therefore, there seemed no reason to doubt that during the storm there had been a sudden change of wind unperceived by us, which had brought our raft back to the shore, which we thought we had left so long a distance behind us. This is B.J. Harrison. I hope you've enjoyed this unabridged production of A Journey to the Center of the Earth, Part 7 of 9 by Jules Verne. If you've enjoyed this episode, please become a supporting member by going to classictalesaudiobooks.com and clicking the appropriate button. And thanks for pitching in. Thank you for joining me today, and and allowing classic literature to awaken your better self. Please join me next time, and we'll rediscover the greatest stories ever put to paper. The Classic Tales podcast is now part of the Airwave Podcast Network.